I love giving these kind of talks because a lot of times you don't get the opportunity to talk about how your organization runs, right? How your organization is set up. And really the intentionality behind how we built our organization so that we can facilitate translation. So this is a graph I always show, and usually have people guess what it is. But it's essentially, if you take PubMed and you type in machine learning and you look at the trajectory of machine learning papers that have been written in the past 20 years. I think my first paper was in 2002, and then my advisor's first paper was in 96 or 95 or 96. So at the time, this was a really sort of a fun thing to do, right? And we just enjoyed it because it seemed kind of cool. But so as you can see, right, it's ramping up exponentially. So let me tell you a little about NYU, and then I'll get a little bit into why I've taken on this role that I have at NYU. So we have 5 inpatient hospitals. We have locations across, all across New Jersey, Long Island, and other places. It looks better this way when you actually see the points and you can see where we are located. Our primary office is here on the star, and that's our main medical center. This is us by the numbers. One thing that if you're that you may notice is that we have a huge number of outpatient visits for the number of patients that we see. And so that's something that's sort of somewhat unique to NYU, and we really focus on outpatient care to change our patients' trajectories, right, to help them be healthier. And there's a lot of visits along those lines. And then we have all sort of the standard in terms of MDs, PhDs, resident fellows, and other things. So by the numbers, we are the #3 medical center in the country, in the US, right? So if we have these US News and World Report things, you have to tell you who first, second, and third is. And so this was very exciting for us. And we've advanced almost, I think, 15 to 20 spaces in the span of like 6 to 7 years. So we're very proud of this. And we have a lot of awards also on the IT side. So we have a very strong medical center IT organization. And that's part of the reason why I can come to you today and tell you about what we do, is because the institution makes inordinately large investments in IT and allows a lot of freedom for IT to think about the future and build today to hit that target. So those are that are familiar with HIMSS. We're a stage 7 organization, which means we really have no paper anywhere. Though the physicians do still carry, papers. For those are physicians, right? They carry papers in their pockets. We're the most wired, computer world. And one thing that we're extremely proud of is we won the Davies Award last year, and where I think we're the first hospital to win the Davies Award, really looking at value-based medicine, clinical pathways, paperless registration, and our arthroplasty bundled payment care initiatives. So as an IT organization, really mature and quite advanced. So who am I? As Allison said, I'm an MD, PhD, got my degree in medical informatics at Vanderbilt University, did a focus on machine learning and text classification. So back then we were using support vector machines, and that was kind of the really cool thing, right, to do at the time. Not so much anymore. Academically, I'm an assistant professor in the Center for Health Innovations and Discovery in the Department of Population Health. I'm director of a clinical informatics training program. I teach a couple courses, which we'll get into near the end. And on the operations side, I'm a director of clinical translational data science. And what that means is really thinking about papers that are published in the literature and trying to understand what are the barriers to getting that paper actually used at the point of care at our institution. And also the director of clinical predictive analytics. Now, this dual appointment on the academic and operational side is actually one of the very reasons we're so successful in what we do. When I talk about the lab and I talk about the unit, we'll talk a little bit about the advantages that we get because we're sort of this dual hybrid group. So why did I get into this? I graduated from medical school and sort of was thinking about what to do next. And throughout my time in medical school, I was sort of sitting around thinking, I've been writing these papers, and my colleagues have been writing these papers, and I keep on seeing headlines like this, right? AI will redesign healthcare. AI is transforming healthcare and solving problems in 2017. And I kept on sitting down saying, well, I wonder how that's going to be the case, right? How? And so people would really talk about all the technical innovations that they would make, but where are the translational implications? Why aren't these models being translated into clinical practice, right? And models have been around for a really long time in medicine, right? There's like port scores, logistic regression, right? It's one of the classic statistical techniques. And yet, when you go and look at fellowship training, you look at residency training, you get medical school training, it's very few times when someone pulls out, an iPhone and sort of, or tries to think, we should really apply this, scoring system to this patient to see what their risk is. Right? And it just doesn't happen regularly. I also, as I said, I see papers like this, and I'm just asking myself, why aren't these things translating? And it got me thinking a little bit about, translational barriers, right? If it was really easy and these things are translating into clinical practice, they should be there, right? They should be part of our training. They should be part of, what we do. And it got me thinking about, okay, well, what is the problem, right? And how can we solve it? So one, there's some technical issues, right? One is there's really poor coupling of model interventions, model predictions to the actual interventions that will affect care, right? And so, you have a great model to predict readmission. Well, okay, what are you going to do with that information? And how do you use that information to actually change someone's trajectory? And that's really unclear. Up to now, there's limited access to hospital data. As all of y'all know, especially the researchers, it can be like very difficult to get hospital data, right? There's privacy issues we have to deal with, right? Ethics issues. Where's the data going to be stored? A lot of contractual obligations about the data and who gets to access it and who gets to use it. And these things are all barriers, right, to actually getting the data. And once you get it, you sort of have this, static data set that's great, right? But then the whole deployment side is totally left out because, the distributions that you train on, right, and the distributions you actually are applying to or testing on, it could be totally different. So you could do great research, publish great papers, and you try to deploy that in practice, and everything falls apart because everything is different. This operational and academic divide. So on the academic side, we're used to getting, like I said, these huge data sets. We do research on them. We publish stuff on them. And then one day you say, you know what, I wonder if we can get this in the clinic. And then now you have to go talk to a whole other group, right? You have to talk to a CIO or an operations person. And they're sort of listening to you, to tell your story. And they say to themselves, well, I have about 1,000 other things to do, right, to help this hospital keep running. And so how can I provide you resources, right? How can I give you the time to translate some of these things and translate these models to actual clinical practice, right? And a lot of times that answer is, well, that's not the scope of what I do, right, as a CIO. And so that can be difficult. Limited evidence of efficacy. So in this readmission example, right, so the readmission happens, well, what's the demonstration that even if you do the intervention, that it actually changes people's trajectories, right? So this model could identify people that are definitely going to be readmitted, right, but they're so sick that no matter what you do and what you try to do, right, they're going to come back to the hospital no matter what. Right? And so there's a whole dearth of actual sort of randomized controlled trials and other things downstream that show that you can take a model, have an intervention, and show that that's going to reduce your readmissions by 10% or 5% or whatever the number is going to be. Right? And it's very similar to what happens in the drug world. Right? In the drug world, we have these pills that we take. Right? They're sort of black boxes in a sense because we eat them. And then there's all these outcomes, right, that people measure. And so if you're taking a hypertensive medication, you see that reduces your diastolic blood pressure, systolics by 5 or 10% or 5 points or 10 points, right? And then the pharmaceutical company is really excited now that they get to sell this drug, and there's some evidence, right, of the efficacy, and then physicians will adopt that, right, and start giving that drug out to their patients. And that same pipeline doesn't happen in predictive predictive models. I think mostly because of the money, right? These pharmaceuticals are very, very wealthy per se, and so they can run these RCTs and randomized controlled trials, whereas in the predictive modeling world, we don't really have that luxury, hopefully yet. And socially, there's really a lot of variable professional training, right, and how to use the technology and what it does. Limited training at the leadership level too. So you may go to your CEO and be really excited about a model, be talking about all the specifics, right, the sensitivities, the specificities, the positive predictive values, how it's going to change, care, and it sort of is beyond sort of the language, right, of what the CEO necessarily understands and what they can and sort of understand how to take that next step. And so a lot of the stuff that I do, and we'll have a slide where I talk about all the meetings that I have, throughout my organization, and a lot of it is education, right? It's a lot of teaching about, what the possibilities are, why this is important, and why you should be spending your time, right, supporting me to do this. Workflow integrations. So, when you come in and you see your physician, right, if you're having a yearly visit, right, there's a specific sequence of things that happen, right? So if you have a predictive model and you have an intervention, right, that has to happen somewhere in this workflow, right, of how the patient is intake and how they're seen, how they're diagnosed, how they're treated, and then when they're discharged, right? And so where in that sequence is this information going to show up? And that's a huge part, right, of actually making these models efficacious, right, of actually making them change people's trajectories. And finally, a lot of stuff about change management. So just a really quick background. So predictive analytics, for those who don't know, it's the process of transforming data into insight for better decision making. There's something called an analytic value chain. So reporting is very common, right? So if we want to know how many people were readmitted, want to know how many people were discharged, and that's just standard reporting, right? And the next step, if you get an increase in readmissions 1 month, is to really figure out what happened, right? And why did that happen, right? And that's where the analytics comes in. So there's something called an analytics maturity model. So descriptive is just what happened. Diagnostics is why did it happen. And predictive, where we stand, is really what will happen. And then you can see here there's varying levels of human input, right? And so NYU is about here. And eventually we want to get NYU to some systems that are here on the prescriptive side, right? I don't know how soon we're going to get to models just doing things, right? And there are some models that the FDA has approved that just sort of do things, right? But there's a whole regulatory process around the sort of applications where there's no human input. Big data, the 4 V's, volume, velocity, variety, veracity. In medicine, we hang a lot of our time in variety and veracity. The volume is large, right? But the volume is not as large as other applications, mostly because a lot of the data is actually human generated, right? So there's an analog process. You see your physician, there's things that happen, and they record that, right, in the digital format. So the actual volume itself is not as huge as you might think. And the speed is sort of slow too, right? On the imaging side, it's pretty fast, right? But in terms of daily care, these are progress notes that are written every day, a discharge summary that's written. So it's not really super high. Now, in terms of variety, there's a lot of variety, right? We have social work notes, we have medical student notes, resident notes, attending notes, imaging notes, and so all that variety and all those differences, right, have to be taken into account as we try to build better predictive models. And finally, veracity, right? Data coming from a medical student is different than data coming from an attending, and we just want to remember that as we're building our models. Medical data, so this is from a paper in 2014. So when we think about medical data, we typically think of this unstructured data here, some of the structured data here, but it's much larger than that. So people using blogs and tweets and Facebook postings, people using things like 23andMe, personal health records, credit card purchases, right? And so there are groups out there that are looking at these other big data sorts of elements, right, to see if they can drive better healthcare. And machine learning, exploring the construction and study of algorithms that can learn from and make predictions on data. It's the glue that turns big data into analytics, right? So we have all this data, and how do we turn it into insights that we can act on? So let me talk a little about the unit. So we have a couple of purposes. One is to increase operational efficiencies. So we're funded operationally, so there's expectation from the CEO and the CIO that they will deliver value, right? Either in quality or in cost. And that's important when you see a little bit later. Building foundations for a learning healthcare system, right? So even simple things like who did you care for, who died, right? And that's actually a pretty hard piece of data, right, that our physicians don't commonly get, right? And so we set up a lot of infrastructure to sort of give feedback loops, right? So the physicians can sort of get better at the things that they're doing. And then translate AI-based models to the point of care. We lead specific projects from inception to development, deployment, and evaluation. And this is actually a really important point. Sometimes the computer science world and the clinical world are sometimes very detached, right? So the clinical people will come up with a problem, and they'll sort of give the computer scientists some of the data, and then the computer scientists will go off and they'll produce a great AUC or a great performance, and then they'll come back to the table and talk to the physicians, give it back to the other side. And so, and there's not a lot of crosstalk in between, right? Sometimes it's this thing that you just hand it over, and then these things happen, and you hand it back, and these things happen. And so, our organization is set up to really be the quarterback, right, overlooking all of this, right? So it's not that we don't just do the modeling, right, and then we hand it off and then we're done, right? We're doing the modeling, we're doing the workflow integration, we're doing the Epic integration stuff that we have to do to get it in the electronic health record. We're doing the education components for the physicians, right, so that they know what this model does and what it's designed to do and what they should expect. And then we're doing the evaluation portions at the end. And that's really helpful because it gives us the ability to see the entire picture and move things through for these projects. We provide education and professional development to support a data-driven decision making. So we're trying to turn our organization as a whole into a data-driven organization. You know, I'm sure you would not be surprised by the amount of data that's actually produced by our organization. And so a lot of people are not trained to use this data or even think conceptually about how this could be useful. And so we have a lot of programs, which I'll talk about near the end, to sort of try to get our employees and our staff and other people thinking along these lines. And finally, a central umbrella organization for clinical data science at NYU and for external collaboration. So, you know, we have the Center for Data Science down at NYU, the actual Washington Square campus. We have a lot of external collaborators that come to us, you know, Google, Microsoft, those guys. You know, we'll have conversations with them about, you know, sort of what it looks like to have collaborations. And so this is all a central organization. And there's actually no vendor that comes to us who has an AI product that doesn't eventually come to my group, because we do a lot of the evaluation there. So the scope of work, we're actually involved in all parts of the hospital. You'll see how our meetings are set up so that we can support all the missions of our hospital. We do build data products. So there are things that we produce as just a daily business of building predictive models, which end up being useful for the rest of the organization. And so we actually have, when you see our org chart, you'll see how we're setting up to have a product manager, right? And that product manager is to turn these artifacts that are created from just creating these predictive models into things that other researchers can use. We build predictive analytics infrastructure. We deploy both our own models and models that are published in the literature. And we do validation. So if a vendor comes to us and say they have an awesome model to predict readmission, we actually have ways of giving them data that's de-identified, that doesn't have the labels, and then we can see how well that model actually works and how it compares to our own internal baselines. And then external collaborations, as I said. So we do have the lab component too. And the lab component is focused on things that are a little bit longer term. Right? So on the operations side, I have pressures to really deliver in the short term, right? Deliver value sort of more immediately. And then on the academic side, I can afford to be a little bit more longer term. And this is where our students really play in. One of the principles I'll talk about a little bit later is this idea of risk, right? And when you're taking on a machine learning project and you're trying to figure out whether it's going to deliver value to the hospital, how do you manage that risk, right? And students are a key way of doing that, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But we studied the science of translation. There's a lot of key questions about predictive models working in a hospital environment that are completely unanswered. For example, how long do you keep a model running, right? How long do you keep it going before you have to rebuild it again, right? This idea of model drift, and we don't know, right? Is it better to have a local model for your institution, or is it better to take a global model that aggregates a lot of other people's data, right? We don't know. Right? And so some of these core questions are scientific questions that you know, we are able to answer because we have access to the data, and then translate AI-based models to the point of care. And you'll see the workflow that we go through when we do this, and how we conceptualize that. So what is so great about having this hybrid academic and operational unit? Well, number one, it aligns our solutions to organizational value. So, you know, if my PhD students or my master's students are working on something, they're working on something that has some operational significance to the institution. It's not a toy problem. It aligns clinical and business clients to the solutions, right? So my PhD students actually talk regularly to the business and clinical clients that we have, right? So they're constantly sort of reinventing and rethinking about the applications that they're building. And that's really nice because they don't get locked into like solving one hypothesis that was generated a year ago and then coming back with something. They're agilely able to change that hypothesis and think about other ways of providing solutions to our clients. Allows access to data for agile prototyping. Because I'm an operational side, right, a lot of the conversations about getting data access and who has it and what the fields are and what the column names are and how to write the SQL queries, all that stuff is built into my organization. And so I can provide de-identified data very easily if I need to, but my students also have access to all the data schemas and everything. So when you say you want all the data, you actually don't want all the data because there's about 500 tables, right, with about 50 to 500 columns in each, right? And so understanding where all this data is made and the provenance behind it and all that kind of stuff, my students spend a lot of time helping to understand that, trying to understand that. And provide some operational discipline. Because I have the pressures in the short term to deliver for our CEOs and our CIOs, right? It tells me that, hey, look, you need to get stuff done. So, I have my operational team really focusing on delivering value, right? And not just sort of answering the next scientific question. It encourages holistic thinking. So when I have students, they come in, they use code, they write code, right? I have engineers whose job is to take that code and try to figure out how they can integrate it into our master branches, right? Because we feel that every piece of work that someone does should be captured and reused for future use. Sometimes in academic, that doesn't happen because, you sort of do your experiments, you write your papers, and then your graduate student leaves, and then the code sort of is gone. And so we're trying to sort of take those intellectual properties, right, those intellectual creations, right, and integrate them into our entire engineering infrastructure. And as I said, to focus on deliverables. So in a nutshell, we focus on implementation, deployment, integration, and evaluation. So how are we set up as an organization? So I'll spend a little bit of time on this slide because I think it's really important to think about how we're able to do things to be successful. So this is me in the center, and you'll see that I report to our CIO, and that's really important because when I need things to get done or I need to get people to help me do stuff, right, he's able to sort of cut through all of that. I also academically, on the other side, I report to our CHIDS director, Leora, and so that's sort of the academic arm of things, right? So making sure that my students, right, don't get so involved in the operational side that they're no longer achieving their goals academically, right? And so there's a lot of check and balances built into this. I have dotted lines where I report to our master's and PhD program director. And as I said, we have this training program, a master's and PhD training program. And so this line is actually really important because it helps us become a data-driven organization because I know the content, right? I know the kinds of things that need to be taught so that our organization can make use of its data. You see another dotted line to the CMIO. And so one thing that you'll not see in this picture is that we don't actually do any Epic integration. And so there's a whole other team who has Epic expertise who actually spends their time, getting best practice alerts, if you're familiar with those, integrated, and doing all that stuff. And that's a really important distinction, a really important boundary that we don't necessarily go into, though we do have a sense of what they're doing. And on the bottom here, you'll see how we're divided. So we have a data science team, right? Data scientists, both PhDs and masters trained folks, what you expect. We have a clinical liaison that we pay. And this clinical liaison is there to help the data scientists understand whether what they've produced is of value, right? So you're creating a mortality model and you give the example that the system emits, right, out of the system. It says that high risk of dying in the next 2 months. So there's a clinical person who sits there with that data scientist and evaluates and says, oh yeah, this looks right. This is the kind of patient we expect to see. And that feedback is really important because it takes away from the black box nature, right? Because these things are black boxes, right? And so we try to evaluate them on the outcome, and the data scientists don't necessarily have the expertise to do that, but with our clinical liaison, they do. We have an evaluation component, so very early on, we have statisticians involved in thinking about how are we gonna measure these things, right? How are we gonna know that this model is having the impact that it needs to have? And so we design up front the right statistical studies, pre-post, other things to try to do that. We have a data management team whose sole job is understanding how to get data out of our electronic health record and how to get results and predictions back in. And so they spend a lot of time doing that. And it's not easy, actually. Some of the constructs are not designed to pull out very large data sets, especially for machine learning models. So we've had to spend a lot of time engineering the right constructs so that we can get very large data pools out of our electronic health record. We have an engineering team, so their job is to make sure that our code is beautiful, that it's stable, and that it's production ready. And yeah, that's their charge. Training master's and PhD students. So next semester I have 7 master's students that are joining the lab. I have 3 PhD students. And a little bit later you'll see how we sort of think about giving them different projects, right? And our thinking behind that. We have a product manager, and so that manager is responsible for turning artifacts that are created from building predictive models into actual products that other people can use. So for example, a labeling platform. So we created something where the notes themselves are actually put into a survey system automatically, and then the clinicians can go and they can look and they can validate the results, right, that come out of these natural language processing systems. Right? And all that stuff we've tried to turn into products because other people at our institution have use for that kind of functionality. And so that way we're always sort of delivering things as we go along. And then project coordinator and a management. A lot of things, because there's so much team involved, right? We try to have project managers and to sort of help guide and set up the meetings and all that other kind of stuff. So what you'll see over here in a couple boxes that aren't connected are actually some of the other areas that are pretty important. So the medical center IT part is actually very important because the medical center treats us sort of like an internal vendor. So when we produce a model, right, we give that over to them, right, being the IT side, and they handle sort of the daily maintenance of the thing, right? So if the system goes down, I don't get the call at like 2 in the morning, right? Someone on their side gets the call. And there's a whole triage protocol in terms of like, what happens if they do reboots, and how the feedback eventually gets back to our team. And that's really important because, we're not charged with keeping these things going from a systems perspective, right? And the IT group is well aligned in their capabilities to do that. Ethics. So before we start every project, we think a little bit about the ethics behind what we're doing, right? And this could just be 5-10 minutes, right? It doesn't have to be a huge allocation of time, but just thinking about, okay, well, what are we doing? Is it right? And are there any unintended consequences that, that we're not thinking of that could possibly happen, right, from the use of this model? Issues of privacy, so where our data resides, is it secure? People are going to be doing things on their laptops, right, or using encrypted drives, and sort of those sort of policy issues, we think of. Contracting, and this is sort of a new addition in the past couple months because now we're thinking at a structural level. We have a couple partners in the U.S. that are almost as capable as we are on the IT side. And we want to start thinking about how we can set up blanket agreements so that we can trade models with each other, right? So if this other institution has a really awesome model we want to apply to NYU, right? How can we have a predefined agreement in place so that they can bring their model to us and we can bring their model to them, right? And we want to try to do this across the board and essentially set up consortia that allow us to do multi-site type of work with almost zero friction. And then finally, tech transfer. So outbaked all of this, right, or what are the opportunities, right? What are the opportunities to scale outside of just what we're doing at our institution, right, to everyone else? At the project level, we do think about our projects in a structured format. This is how we think about them. And every project comes through this mental thinking, right, about the project and the dimension that falls under. So obviously project goal and business understanding, data quality and availability, right? Sometimes we get clinicians that come to us and say, it'd be awesome for you to do this project. And we go look at the data and we realize that the data just isn't good enough, right? And so immediately at the beginning, we already put the brakes on trying to do something and spending a lot of time before we get there. Predictive model performance. So this is defined by the clinical side, right? So maybe you have a great predictive model that has a certain AUC, right? But the false positive rate is too high, right, for any particular intervention. And so if the false positive rate is too high, there's really nothing you can do, so we put the brakes on the project and we don't move forward with it. Alternate solutions, sometimes it's cheaper to buy, and we're always willing to buy if there's a solution out there for a problem that we have that will solve our problem. Operational deployment. Maybe you have something, you have a great predictive model to do something, but you want to show a great visualization, or you want to incorporate some sort of really fancy, something that's beyond what our vendor can provide, right? And that's a barrier because we can't really move forward if you want to do something really fancy on the interface side because we have limitations with what our vendor allows us to do. Maybe the clinical interventions aren't that great, right? So maybe you can predict someone who's going to get sepsis, right, in the next 4 hours, but the things you actually do for them, right, may not change their trajectory. Right? And so we have some thinking up front from the clinical side about, well, what would you do if you got this information? And is that thing that you would do actually efficacious? Right? And sometimes we don't know the answer. And so we think at least a few minutes about that. Can we measure the outcomes? What's the return on investment, core risks, the timeline, and finally, at the bottom, ethics and privacy. As I said, we describe any potential ethics or privacy concerns with this project. So we go through this process, and then we actually have sort of these phases that we talk about. So we have some phases where something is sponsored, it's proposed, it's planned, it goes active, and then concurrently we have the model, right, where it's built, it's evaluated silently, actually in the background at the hospital for anywhere from 2 to 3 months. And then after that silent period is over, we'll actually look at the results, right? We'll look at the outcome and say, okay, well, you have a model to predict readmission. Okay, in the 3 months it was running, how often did it actually predict readmission, right? And this is really important because the training distributions, right, the data we use to train the models can be very different from the time when you're actually testing the models and applying it. And so we want to be absolutely sure that the general performance that we're getting is actually the performance we get when we actually deploy these models. There's clinical workflow that happens simultaneously. So on the clinical side, the Epic people and the clinical people figure out, well, what's the goal? What's the workflow going to be? How people are going to use this information? And what's the validation process? Then we move into phase 2. And in phase 2 is the model's deployed, it's running. And on the clinical side, they think about validation, building the solution, and actually implementing the solution. And then concurrently, there's a reporting and evaluation step. And then finally, operationally, is when you actually scale to everyone, right? So you have an educational roadshow where you go out, you tell everybody about the model, how it works, what its limitations are, what the expectations are of the model, and then finally maintenance, right? So we have dashboards in place that actually monitor the drifts, right, of these models. And so they do deteriorate over time. And we haven't hit a point where they've deteriorated so bad that we've actually had to rebuild them. But we do see times when they have dropped. And we've had some technical issues too, where the data feeds actually dropped out on us because of some upgrade issues, right? And we were able to detect that immediately and basically shut down the system, repair that, and then bring it back up again. And that's part of being a production environment, right? Is being able to monitor and know when things change. So we have a couple meetings. So one was you have an executive meeting that happens quarterly with all our chiefs, so our CIOs, our COOs, and the CEOs. And these are really high-level meetings with chiefs of hospitals to just get a complete alignment, right? That we're doing what we're supposed to do, that they're happy with what we're supposed to do, and that we can get leadership support, right, to bring all the different groups of people together. We have a portfolio meeting every month where we meet the stakeholders in our organizational chart. So in the organizational chart there, you saw a bunch of different organizations meeting together. So we have a meeting monthly where all those people are together in a room and we talk about the projects that we have going on. I have a leadership meeting every 2 weeks where I meet with Leora and Nader, my 2 direct reports, just about any issues that come up. It's an opportunity to talk about those in a sort of a small environment. I have engineering weekly meetings with my direct reports. I have a steering quarterly meeting. So this is where I get represented from all across the hospital, all those 6, 7, 8 units that you saw. And basically I bring to them a sort of a portfolio of all the new projects that have been proposed, right, in the last quarter. And then they get to sit around and think about, oh yeah, that's a great idea. I think that would be useful for me here, useful for me there. And it's a great opportunity to engage the entire organization in what you're doing and really try to find the market, right? And the startup where we try to product market fit, right? And that's an opportunity to try to find the market, to find the people that would be that could use your sort of your product. A unit vision meeting, so this meets every 2 weeks with my direct reports and the community. So this is where we do journal clubs. This is where people will come with open source tools like Airflow and other things and say, hey, maybe this is something we should implement at our organization, right? And that's where we have conversations about those type of things. And then we have an internal portfolio meeting. So any of my direct reports, anyone in the community can actually come up with an idea and come to us and say, hey, I have this great idea. I want to do X, Y, and Z, right? And then there's a whole group of us that sort of sit around and think about the technical aspects of whether we can do that or not. So let me talk a little bit about the case study. Let me see what time it is. Does anyone have the time?
I left this thing over.
Quarter till. Okay, good. So I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the principles of successful translation. And I wanted to tell parts of our story using this mortality prediction model that we deployed about 3 weeks ago, sort of as a thematic structure. So what's the clinical need here? The clinical need is supportive care. So at least in the US, a lot of money and effort and time is spent in the last sort of few months of life, right? And that's sort of a double-edged sword because we're spending a lot, but then people are not dying the way that they want to die, right? The quality of the deaths themselves are not that great. And also, sometimes you're prolonging life for, not really any reason besides, it's a number, right, to prolong the life. And so we wanted to come up with a way to really have better discussions, right, and prolonged invasive care beyond, and people get care beyond their own desires, little to no benefit in their quality of life. And interventions such as advanced care planning can help ensure that providers, families, and patients are on the same page and understand the patient's wishes. Mortality is an AI prediction opportunity, mostly because humans and providers are actually really not that great at it. So there's something called the mandatory surprise question. It's a question to ask, would you be surprised if this patient was going to die in the next 6 months? And when you look at the numbers, humans are about 50% sensitive and 50% precise, right? So of all the people that die in the next 6 months, right, they're about 50% right. When they do say someone is going to die in the next 6 months, they're right 50% of the time, right? And so this is an opportunity to really, sort of bring AI to the picture. And you can see this, these are 2 studies that concluded sort of, that the mandatory surprise question is just not doing that well. Yeah, and you can see here more evidence. So that leads into sort of, how are we successful? So what you're going to see here so I actually have this deck that has sort of 79 principles across all 10 different categories, actually. And so you're going to see some different numbers come up because that's just the way that I've numbered them as I've been thinking about them. And I'm going to talk about this particular example and some of the principles about how we're successful and why this model that has been deployed has been sort of accepted at our institution. One is just really good architecting, right? So really upfront thinking about what you're going to do and why you're going to do it. And so we have a 3-meeting series, right? One is requirements gathering. The second is a summary and review. And the third is sort of a go-ahead, like a green light or a green, yellow, or a green or red light meeting. In the requirements meeting, we do the stuff that you saw, right, sort of in the table, define the business use case. We identify, so in this case, right, end of life is a double-edged sword. And the specific thing we wanted to do was to identify patients that would die in a 2-month window and really allow the clinical team to step back and pause for a second and really think about the things that they're doing, right, and whether those things are aligned, right, with the patient's wishes and with the patient's wishes and the family's wishes. We wanted to find a predictive model performance. So, we have 2 months death or hospice on a mission with a positive predictive value of 80%. Right? So we want the model, when it fires, to be right 80% of the time that this patient will die in the next 2 months. Right? And that's an operational definition that came from our clinical leads when they were thinking about, okay, when we pause and think about the things that we're going to do, right? That was the level that they wanted to have, right, in terms of being sure and about the intervention that would happen downstream. Define effective and cost-effective interventions. So what are you going to do, and defining that early, right from the get-go. Because a lot of times you can have a model, you ask the clinicians, well, what would you do for this situation? And they sort of say, I don't know, I'm not sure. Right? So there's some anecdotes of a sepsis model that was deployed at one of our other institutions, right? And so at fire, the patients would go to the providers would go to the bedside, and they would not really know what to do because maybe the patient didn't look sick, right? And there's not any guidelines that really tell you what to do in those situations, right? We know when people are diagnosed with sepsis, there's a clear set of things that you need to do, right? But if they don't look septic yet, are you really allowed to do anything, right? You could give fluids, right? You give antibiotics, but all those have side effects, right, downstream. So you don't just jump to doing something. Define the measurement metrics. So, what are you going to measure? What do you want people to actually do based on this model, and can you measure that? And then ethical considerations and privacy considerations. And there's a summary and review. So in that summary and review, we go back, we do a literature review, we try to see what other people have done in this space. We consider alternate solutions. So is there something to buy that could solve this problem? We define our costs and return on investment. We define project killing risks. So what are risks of this project that could just scuttle the project? Maybe because the classification is too hard, right? Maybe there are fundamental theoretical problems about the way this model is built that it's not going to work. And actually, you see this because in our mortality models, there's a whole class of conditions that's actually not very good at predicting, right? And it probably has to do with the pathophysiology of the disease. Take congestive heart failure, for example, right? If you have pretty severe congestive heart failure, you might not be able to say, that yes, they will probably, have die in the next year or 2 years, right? But to say you can do it in a 2-month window is really, really difficult, right? And so that's probably a limitation on the pathophysiology side in terms of how the patient is presenting and whether you can actually connect that, whether that outcome is actually predictable. Define deliverables and dates, resource to deliver. Right? So every project, we think long and hard about the right people who need to be involved in that project to actually deliver the solution. And then meeting 3 is the final go-ahead and approval. So principle 4 is have a multidisciplinary team. So who comes to these meetings that we have? We have this meeting actually every 3 weeks with our clinical team. And you can see some of the people here. We have the COO, we have the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Medical Informatics Officer, have my data science lead, I have my data science support group, or support, so the people that support him, a statistician, I have an Epic integration team lead, a clinical informatics team lead, clinical champions, and project managers. And it gets even bigger if you start talking about some of the HCI people. So we have human-computer interface people that we can get involved with as well if we start thinking that there's going to be some HCI problems on the other side. So really large teams, right, to really move this thing forward and get it done. Principle 75 is a predictive model lifecycle. And so this is sort of the life cycle of how these models are produced. So you have a data gathering phase, model building, model testing, regression testing, instance submitting, right? And the instance submitting part is actually one of the most important things that we do to deploy these models. And what that means is that we actually, as soon and as quickly as possible, we build a model and we start prospectively sending examples of what the model is classifying to the physicians and the frontline people, right? And that's really important for 2 reasons. Number one is sometimes these things are black boxes, so we don't actually know the types of patients and the characteristics of the patients that are being identified. So it gives the opportunity for us to actually sort of validate and legitimize, right, the things that are being emitted. And the second thing is it makes its clinical team really confident and happy that the thing is doing what it's supposed to do, right? And when you're selling this to the clinical side, right, they have to be shown that it works, right? It's shown that it's doing what it's supposed to do. And that gives us the opportunity to do that. It also gives the clinical team a third advantage. Is number 3 is that they can start thinking about the clinical workflow, right, and the things that they're going to do for these patients. So you think about it at a very high level when they actually define the project, right? But then once they actually start seeing the patients, right, then they start to get creative, right? Then they start thinking about, oh yeah, well, for this type of patient we could do this, for that patient we could do that, right? And that's when it gets really exciting on the clinical side, because a priori you might define what you might see, but you don't exactly know. But then once you actually start to see the patients, right, then you really start to be able to define that. And then you see Epic integration, deployment, clinical application, measurement, monitoring, widespread adoption, and maintenance. And these are sort of, it's just a visual representation of some of the steps I showed you earlier. Clear organizational boundaries. So as I've said, I have a predictive analytics team. We have an Epic integration clinical informatics team, right? So I don't have any Epic people on my side. We just focus on building the models, evaluating the models, understanding when they don't work and why they don't work and whether we can fix it. These guys focus on the Epic integration side, right? Getting the best practice alerts and other things and getting those working. There's a whole workflow development integration side. So it's a bunch of clinicians, right, in that particular area that think about what are we going to do in this situation, right? And they work on that. And then also the clinical intervention as well. And these boundaries are really important because it really gives people the right mission, right, within each group to accomplish what they need to accomplish. And once you put them all together, right, then you can deliver the value that you're hoping to deliver. Manage expectations. So this is a pretty big one. There's sort of a hype curve in AI, I'm sure, people will talk about, AI is going to revolutionize this, it's going to revolutionize that. It's going to be so amazing. It's actually a lot harder. AUCs, area under the curve, is a common metric, for evaluating performance. And, we may celebrate AUCs like 0.85, 0.8. But when you actually look at the patients that are identified, right? If you look at the precision recall curves, you look at the false positive rates, right? Then everyone sort of steps back a little bit and says, wow, maybe this false positive rate is still too high for us to actually do anything on the intervention side. And so having that conversation early and managing that expectations is really important so that everyone knows what to expect. Workflow first, AI second. And this is probably one of the most important things that we've learned, right? Is that you really need to have a workflow for what you're going to do with this information before you actually think about how AI is going to solve that. Sometimes you go into situations being like, oh, I have this AI system, it's amazing. We can take wearable data, telemetry data, and I can do this prediction, right? But the thing is, there's no workflow around that, right? No one studied, okay, if I take this wearable information and I can predict this outcome, well, what am I going to do for this patient, right? And so that's why I always say, well, let's think about the workflow first, right? And then we can build an AI solution around that. There will be novel solutions that come up, right? So like the Apple Watch, came out recently, has the ECG monitor, right? It can detect arrhythmias, right? And there will be a workflow that's built around that eventually, right? But if you're thinking about low-hanging fruit and things you can do today to drive operational value, right? You really got to think about the workflows that exist already and how you can optimize that, right? And one example that we have at our institution is better care coordination prioritization. So we have a lot of people that get phone calls from our institution that say, hey, I want to coordinate you and help you in your care in the next 2 months. Well, that's an existing workflow. And all we had to do is go in there and say, okay, out of 900 patients that are recommended, who's going to pick up the phone, right? And so we were able to build AI models around trying to prioritize who these people are going to be called. Managing risk and reward. So some of these projects, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if the predictive model is going to work. And that's really, as I alluded to earlier, where our students fit in. So I have operational people that have to deliver short-term value, right, to deliver things today. And I have students that really can think about the sort of publishable, the questions that are unanswered, right? And they have the luxury to do that because they're students, right? There's no pressure on them, right, to do something today. And it's a really wonderful arrangement that we have because, yeah, we can manage this risk, and I can manage this risk and reward by having these students do the things that are risky, right? May not have reward, but if they're successful, will be rewarding. And then my core team can actually focus on delivering the short-term value. So in terms of reflective, about this mortality project, one thing I'd say, okay, great, is better literature review. So one of the reasons we did the project was because there was a paper published by a pretty well-known researcher that indicated us that this was possible to do, right? That 2-month mortality was like, a doable problem. They were doing a slightly different problem. And it turns out that, I should have spent more time reading this paper because the details were so important. And there were some details, which we're actually writing a paper about in a couple months, sort of rebutting this paper, that were so important that we have not been able to actually reproduce this paper. And so this was a huge risk for us. We found out about it a couple months into the project. And so we've had to step back and really reframe and redefine the problem. And so I should have done a much better and closer lit review and really look at the details before recommending that we move forward with this project. Principle 35, find your use case and sell the pivot. So we define a use case, and that first use case actually, the 2-month mortality was actually really hard in the beginning, right? Our false positive rates are really high, and the sensitivities that we're getting at 80% positive predictive value were just really low. And so from that, we said, well, okay, let's pivot a little bit. Let's think about 6-month mortality, right? And if I can recommend 6-month mortality better, maybe I can, push another workflow. And so that allowed us to sort of have our use case, right? But then sell a pivot, right? To do something else with that exact same model and drive value. Define the measurement metrics. We should have done a better job of up front. We didn't actually have that conversation until like the last 2 months of the project. And so we should have really have done that earlier. So training in like my last 2 minutes, I'll just talk about why training is so hard in medical informatics. First is because we get people with a lot of different backgrounds, right? You get computer scientists that don't know anything about medicine or biology. You get biologists who aren't necessarily computer scientists or medical people. And you get clinical people that don't know any of the other two. And so trying to get people all on the same plane and all in the same proficiencies, right? It can be very difficult with all these different backgrounds. So, we really think a lot about what are the array of skills needed to assess, build, deploy, display, and measure clinical predictive models, and how does clinical data drive these needed skills. We have a master's, a PhD program. We have certificate programs. You can take 3 courses and actually get a certificate from the state. We also have a fellowship program. So if you're a physician, you can actually do informatics as a fellowship and get board certified. And those are coming soon. And we have a continuing education program. And we actually have faculty and staff that come to, our training to learn about what we do. Yeah, so we have a couple core courses: Introduction to Clinical Informatics, Introduction to Biomedical Informatics, Machine Learning, Clinical Decision Support, Evaluation Methods in IT, and Soft Skills Practicum. Especially because of the translational and the group nature of what we do, we really emphasize this sort of soft skills, right? Giving presentations, talking, sort of, selling people on things, because it's such a vital skill to have, especially because you're working with so many different people. And then optional, we have biomedical vocabulary, so learning about UMLS, ICD-10, SNOMED, and how those vocabularies and those ontologies can help solve mapping problems for you, right, when you're thinking about these clinical problems. Natural language processing, data visualization, analytics at the population health level, and then advanced machine learning in healthcare. And then, yeah, a bunch of stuff about the actual syllabuses, so you can see some of the content, but we have no time. So, you can review these when, if you see the recording, you could just pause it as you go along. So, yeah, clinical support, evaluation methods, natural language processing, soft skills. All right. And then translation. And I'll just close with how we support translation across our institution. So our general strategy is to provide an outlet. There are so many people that are so excited about machine learning that they want to talk to me all the time, right? And I want to provide an outlet for that, because the thing that scares me the most in a huge organization like ours is that people start trying to identify solutions on their own, right? They start hiring people on their own without the benefit of having our community there. And it's not that I want to micromanage. I don't want to micromanage at all, right? But I want to make sure people have the right conversations. We recently had a project that people got involved with. We didn't get involved until about 3 or 4 months later. And this was, really tough, because by the time we got involved, I looked back at the problem they were solving and said, that's not exactly the right problem that you guys have been working on for 3 or 4 months, right? And so it's helpful to be involved just a little bit early on. And connect providers to use cases. So I'm constantly sending out use cases that I define in particular categories to people, because I don't know what's going to get to pique the provider's interest. I don't know what they're going to see that's going to excite them, right? So I'm constantly sending out things that I find in particular areas, right? So they can look at it, people at the chair level, to sort of say, oh yeah, wow, that's really cool, right? And then once their interest gets piqued, then we can engage them. We have quarterly data science and medicine lectures and classes through our health sciences library. So these are just sort of broad overview, machine learning, clinical healthcare, clinical data science type of meetings to engage with the public. We have every 2-week journal clubs, real technical and clinical applications. We have unit and department roadshows. So, I'll go to the different departments, talk about what we do, how we do it, how I can help you. We have what I call funnels to our unit. So, sometimes the CIO or the CMIO will get a request from someone, and they know to triage that request to us and our team so that we can sort of follow up. Consultations, so we do have a consultation group. So it's sort of an open time when people can just send us emails, they can show up, they can talk to us, sort of like an office hours. And then promotion by leadership. So you saw that we have all the chiefs involved, right? And that's really important, because when things come up, when they think of things that they want to do, right, they're able to connect back with us. Okay, so let me just end on our partnership vision. A little bit earlier, I said that I really wanted to set up frameworks for seamless trading of workflows and models and know-how and workflows, right? We're not the only institution that's solving, we're solving some particular problems for us, right? You guys are solving particular problems for you. But how can we set up a legal framework, or IP framework, a tech transfer framework, so that we could actually share these models back and forth, right? And to really see that efficacy. And that's what we're really working on now, is trying to engage our contracting and trying to engage legal to think about how we can have these blanket agreements so that we can all benefit, right, from these models. A huge team, a lot more people than this, and thank you for your time.